Giles Brown. Let's talk.
You're listening to Giles Brown on Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. Pox Romana, the plague that shook the Roman world. It's a dramatic account of the Antonine Plague, the mysterious disease that struck the Roman Empire at its pinnacle. It's also the subject of a great new book by Colin Elliott. Delighted to say that Colin joins me live on the line now. Good afternoon from us. Good morning to you.
Great to see you, Giles. Great to be with you.
Just whereabouts are you, by the way, on the planet today?
So I am in Bloomington, Indiana, which is sort of in the middle of nowhere, but the center of everywhere, right in the smack dab middle of the United States.
Marvellous. Well, on my other hat, I'm a big motor racing fan, so that you just mentioned that word and off we go.
That's right. Hour away from the Indy 500, coming up in a month, I think.
Well, it's sort of the version of a sort of a modern chariot race. There you are. So I managed to segue it seamlessly into there. Set the scene, if you will, then, about what period of Rome are we at? Because we know about the Pax Romana, don't we? Which is Marcus Aurelius and this huge empire.
Yeah, that's right. So we're talking about the middle of the 2nd century AD, about 165. And it looks like it is going to be an awesome time in the Roman Empire. We've got Marcus Aurelius in charge, who is a kind of philosopher king, the guy really that the Romans have been waiting for a long time, a man who is moderate and sober and just sort of a long-term thinker in many ways. And there is trade, there's connectivity. The Romans rule a territory that is that encroaches into 3 different continents. So everything looks very, very good when we get to the 160s AD for the Romans.
And I mean, just thinking about this, in an age, and I know this is going to sound from the Ministry of the Bleeding Obvious, but in an age before modern communications, to have that amount all the way from the far-flung tribes of ancient Britain through to almost Mesopotamia. I mean, they're battling off the Persians, presumably, at this point as well, aren't they? So
you've got it exactly right. They're in the middle of a very successful war with Persia and encroaching all the way down the Euphrates and Tigris down into Babylon. So it is a massive territory. In fact, it is about the same size as the current contiguous United States.
And it's because one of the great sort of ironies of the Roman Empire is that Roman emperors don't tend to be killed by the barbarians, but be killed by other Romans. So is Marcus Aurelius then? He's for the first time he's sort of strong and stable, and this is why there is this great Pax Romana.
Yeah, Marcus actually inherits a period of time in which we've got about 100 years where we have not had any kind of major civil war. And that's why we call it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. This wasn't so much that Rome was not off fighting wars outside of its territories, but inside the Roman Empire, it was relatively stable, long-lasting rules of emperors. And again, for the elites at least, everything looks like it's going to be smooth sailing for centuries to come.
So you're sitting there in your beautiful Tuscan villa. You're debating, the rolling countryside. The couple of slaves are working the agricolae in the fields and all that. I did schoolboy Latin, as you can tell, and debating whether you should go off to the Colosseum or not. That evening or whatever, and suddenly, like a week later, people are feeling unwell, and the next thing you know, this is probably it's the first pandemic, isn't it? And I use those words advisedly.
Yeah, it's funny. Your characterization is surprisingly accurate. So it was the case that a couple of weeks before this thing went into Rome, the Romans were celebrating a triumphal parade in the city of Rome. Tens of thousands of soldiers and vendors and just the general population all excited about the victory against the Persians. And we would call this nowadays a super spreader event, because those soldiers that came back from Persia had carried with them a deadly disease. We still don't know what it was, but about a couple of weeks later, it just infected the city of Rome and started spreading from the heart of Rome there throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, mostly into the cities. It was deadly. It was contagious. It had some pretty nasty symptoms like a high fever, ulcers in the throat. I won't get into worse
Some
details.
People will be having their breakfast. Yes.
Exactly. That's right. But there were some other things that were pretty nasty. And I'll say the other symptom was a pustular rash, which kind of looks a little bit like modern smallpox. So the disease had this pox nature to it, hence the book title, Pox Romana.
And of course, in the Roman cities, everybody lives very close to each other. I mean, okay, if you're out and if you've got a Roman villa out in the UK, in Britain, you've got those Anglo-Roman places. But otherwise, if you're in Rome, it is very much a cheek by jowl existence. So you do think, I mean, Roman life is on the streets. You shop on the streets, you bathe together, you debate together. You don't. I mean, social distancing does not happen. And of course, we have, and every schoolboy laughs at this. The vomitoriums and the public latrines. And so this is something that's going to really take hold before anybody knows what's hit them.
That's right. And this is kind of one of the arguments of the book, that these cities were primed for a novel disease to come in and strike. The reasons that you mentioned are there, the high density, but also a lot of the infrastructure in the cities that we think of as infrastructure that promotes cleanliness and public health was in fact not always doing that. So the bath water was tepid. It didn't circulate. It was, people that were already diseased and injured would wash in it. The sewer system was frequently backed up. There were floods in the cities. There were all sorts of microbes and bacteria that were just there, weakening people. The populations of the Roman Empire, even in the cities, were surprisingly undernourished. They had food insecurity issues. And so funnily enough, all of this connectivity and prosperity and urbanization in the Roman Empire ended up being a source of great weakness. Once this disease starts rocketing through the cities of the Roman Empire, it could spread to populations that were essentially sitting ducks for this pandemic.
Now, here's something I hadn't really thought of before, but Roman medicine. I mean, doctors. I mean, presumably, if you get ill, the first thing is to grab the nearest mammal and head off to go and sacrifice to the nearest god, I would imagine, because you would obviously displease them somehow. Was that the first reaction? Was there? I mean, obviously, medieval. We've got the balancing of the humours, for example. Mm-hmm. But in Roman medicine, was it a case of there was very basic medicine, almost sort of druidic, or was it based on anatomy? Or just explain, if you would, if you can, Colin.
Yeah, I want to be sensitive again to your listeners' stomachs, so I won't go
we've given them the 3-minute warning. Go for it.
All right. They know what's going to happen now. So really, the favored cure for the Antonine Plague was urine. So just having somebody urinate on you, especially if the younger the person, the better, was a great cure. Obviously, didn't work, but that was the sort of the go-to cure. But you're right about just leaving. The Romans don't understand germ theory, but they do understand contagion. And so they try to escape this disease. And with a typical disease in the ancient world, that works because they're regionally contained, or they're contained even to a neighborhood. Just getting out of the area works. But when you've got a pandemic that affects most cities in the Roman Empire, suddenly there is nowhere to escape. And now this sets in motion a religious crisis, because for the Romans, a disease or an earthquake or a volcano, this is not merely a natural phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that is caused by very angry deities. And the gods must be very upset to inflict the Roman world with a pandemic. And so they begin to press into the worship of a variety of gods associated with the plague, Apollo, Artemis, and others. And when that begins to fail, then they turn to much darker places.
It's interesting as well, is it? Because this is the first time that we have this recorded plague stroke pandemic. But from this point onwards, like the pantomime villain, the plague will appear especially in early Middle Ages and through to the Reformation. I'm thinking 60-65 in England, the Great Plague followed by the Great Fire. But it comes and suddenly everything will be going well, and then suddenly, as the member of our own mortality, the plague will come, Black Death, call it what you will, and wipe out 40%, 60% of the population, and then it's basically a version of 28 Days Later. Is that the sort of? But again, they think because the Lord is upset because we've been using dissolute lives and we've been sitting back and we've been straying from the path, and presumably then this is what the Romans think, and B, it allows people who've got an alternative view, as we call it now, to say, well, this is the problem and we need to be doing this, and I'm going to have a crack at authority because it's the elites, Colin. It's the elites again.
So the alternative view was promoted by this small group of people, about 40,000 individuals that believed in worshiping one God. And they believed that that God was actually bringing a judgment. And these, of course, were the Christians. They did not participate in the approved mitigation measures that the Romans were promoting, worshiping non-Christian deities, getting involved in a variety of rituals and sacrifices and auguries and all that. The Christians were not interested in any of that. And so this made them an obvious target for the Romans as they are looking to figure out who is it that is responsible for this massive plague. And so what we see during this period is a major persecution of Christians in what is now modern France, for example. About 50 men, women, and children are executed, and then their corpses are burned. So that's really where the Romans go, is they start getting into these superstitions and scapegoating at the same time.
And so, how does Marcus Aurelius deal with it? I mean, he's a thinker. He's not a Nero. He doesn't decide to burn everything down just for the laugh of it. So, and he's not a madman. So, how does he rationalize this? And how does he sort of stem the rising panic that must be gripping Rome at this point?
So Marcus was one of the, like I said, the few true philosopher kings in all of human history, and he is a Stoic. So he is a philosopher that believes that we should not try to escape pain, and we should also not seek out pleasure. We should accept the moment as it comes. And so when the pandemic first erupted in Rome in 166 AD, he's very calm. He can't stop the disease from spreading, but what he can do is pass laws that prevent people from just dumping corpses anywhere they can. He holds funerals for both elites, but also for the common people, like days of remembrance for the people that had died. Just a way to remind people of their common humanity and the fact that everybody went through something that was really challenging. Now, I will say Marcus was not perfect. So there is a second outbreak of this disease a few years later, a little bit north of Rome in the city of Aquileia in northern Italy. And when that happens, Marcus is like, well, look, I've seen this before. I know how bad this is. And his co-emperor and a few of his buddies just jet out of that city and leave everybody else there. So in the first instance, Marcus is very stoic and very consistent with what we'd expect. In the second instance, he's a little bit more pragmatic, and he just books it out as quickly as he can.
So, where do you get the sources for this? Because as a historian, as a writer, how do you find the stories that bring this to life, as it were?
Yeah, so there's a reason that this book is coming out now, despite the fact that we've known about this pandemic for 2,000 years. For the longest time, we only had the literary sources, the sources that were written around the time or just shortly thereafter by the Romans themselves, and they are a mess. So it's very difficult to describe how messy they are. There's just, conflicting information, exaggeration. It's just very difficult to get our grips on what this disease was. We just know that it was a big deal. And so there's not enough to write a book on it. But what we now have, because of the interest in climate change, we have a lot of scientific evidence that has accumulated in the last few decades trying to get a long-term view of the climate. And so we have things that you would never expect to tie to plagues, like tree ring data and data about how much ice, the pollutants that are occurring in Greenland ice over the course of thousands of years. And what those sources show us is that prior to the Antonine Plague, there were some changes in the climate that actually made that part of the world more susceptible to a disease, both in terms of like the general picture in that it became a bit drier and cooler in that part of the world, but also in terms of the food supply. So the rains over the south, let me start again. So Egypt, for example, where the Romans get the majority of their food from, experienced a series of droughts in the decade prior to the Antonine Plague, leading to general malnutrition, especially in the city of Rome, but also among the Roman military and other cities as well. And so what this tells us is that this was a disease that the way was prepared for it, I guess is what I'm saying. The population was in a situation, and even nature itself was sort of conspiring against the Romans.
So it's that little Petrus dish, and people whose immune systems would be down. And again, you've got great communications because of the Roman roads, and the Roman military is doing great things. So people are changing, legions coming back and forth. Absolute, as I said, super spreader conditions.
Yes, and even the food supply issue is even worse because this is causing a lot of internal migration. So you just talked about the Roman army and trade. That's bringing things into the Roman Empire. But then inside of the Roman Empire, because people are losing their farms, they're hungry, they can't get food, they're just crowding into the cities, which is where they could often get distributions of food from elites, and in the city of Rome from the Roman emperor himself. And so suddenly a lot of people that were not used to all of the bacteria and pathogens and disease that were there in these cities were crowding in those places. And so we just have now additional evidence that gets us a greater picture of the landscape, of the canvas onto which the literary sources paint this picture of plague. It just gives us a much more complete picture.
Any idea of what numbers we're talking perished? I mean, that's the difficulty. I imagine they don't have the being able to tally them up because it's such a huge plague. But is there a guesstimate figure of how many people throughout the empire lost their lives to this plague?
Historians are hotly debating this issue and have been for some time, and partly because we don't know what the disease was, that makes it difficult to model the mortality. The literary sources do claim that many people died. Lots of them died. In some cases, a majority of people in a city died. Can we take that at face value? I'm not so sure. I'm a bit more of a skeptic of the high mortality argument. I think we're probably talking about more like 5% at most of the Roman Empire. That's not a small number. The Roman Empire is about 50 to 60 million people. So we're talking about maybe 2, 4, 5 million people. Not small, but the real seriousness of this plague was in its pandemic nature. This was the first time a disease could strike anybody, anywhere. And that really scares people. It frightens them. It changes the way that they think about diseases, about the gods, about really themselves and the world. And so that legacy is really important.
This is the thing, isn't it? One of the reasons I love history is because it doesn't repeat itself, but there are echoes. And people take that chance to reevaluate what they're here for, as we saw in massive neon letters only a couple of years ago. But it is important in the Roman points because it does suddenly reveal the cracks to this. And we're here, and I know it sounds like it's going to sound, but literally sort of 400 years later or 300 years later, there won't be a Roman Empire. The Roman Empire will have become, the home, and it will have become the Holy Roman Empire, and what's being fought over around Rome and Italy. So it does sow the seeds of something much bigger that will come, and that glorious Roman period, and I'm using those in huge parentheses, which everybody thinks of as Colosseums and Caesar and all that will be gone forever.
Yeah, you've got it, Giles. That's, to me, the enduring legacy of this pandemic, and its most fascinating connection to what we all experienced. The Antonine Plague was not at the level of, say, the Black Death or the smallpox pandemics of the early modern period, but it really freaked people out, and it also accelerated other things that were kind of going on that were beneath the surface. So Rome's food system, for example, was already starting to show some cracks in the state's ability to actually haul food all the way from Egypt in sufficient quantities to feed the cities and to pass it out for free. Rome's migration issues, there were budding criminality and desertion issues in the military that had not been addressed. And so what the pandemic does is it just immediately jets people into this state of panic, and so much of society's efforts and energies gets mobilized into dealing with and confronting with and just enduring this disease. And so suddenly all of these things that were just under the surface come into the fore quite dramatically and rapidly, and maybe a little bit before their time, such that they begin to overwhelm the Roman Empire. And I think, not to go too far out of my lane, but I think that's kind of similar to what we ourselves experienced, right? COVID, we increasingly found out that this disease was not as deadly as we thought it was, but our reaction to it, right, was just over the top in many ways. I think we can all mostly agree with that now, and it's set in motion a set of conversations that maybe we didn't intend to have, but we're all having now and will be having for the next few decades.
I've just had this wonderful vision of the Goths, the Alans, and whatever on the sort of the side of the Rhine, and the Vandals on the side of the River Rhine, going, I'm not going to cross there. Looks a bit crazy over there. I think we'll stay where we are. What do you hope that people are going to take from Pox Romana, apart from the great title?
Yeah, the great title is there, so pick it up for the title. My hope also is that they get a real sense of the social nature of disease, not just disease as a once-in-a-generation shock that just comes in and destroys a perfectly functioning Roman Empire, but that they read the book and get a more detailed, nuanced sense of what the Roman Empire was at the end of its Pax Romana, and the great complexity and just intriguing nature of how this vast, glorious, great empire actually manages to transform into what we would see in late antiquity and into the Middle Ages. Disease is a part of that story, but disease also is a lens through which we can understand these more complicated and really just frankly interesting causes to the fall of Rome.
The book is called Pox Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World. It's by Colin Elliott, who's been to today. Colin, if people want to find you online, do you have a social media presence? Is there a Pox Romana website? Where can we find you?
The best way, Giles, if folks enjoyed this and want more, is to check out my podcast, which is the Pax Romana podcast, paxromanapodcast.com. You can find that anywhere podcasts are available. I take the Roman history that I do in my university classroom and put it out in 15-minute snippets or so for the general public. Best place to get a hold of me.
Wonderful. And the book is going to be available as a download, or an order, from our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Pox Romana. It is by Colin Elliott. Colin, thank you so much for your time today.
Giles, really appreciate talking to you. Thanks a bunch.